She dies in his arms. Every single night in opera houses around the world, from Milan to Melbourne, from Paris to São Paulo, from the grandest theatres in Vienna to provincial houses in small Italian cities, she dies. Coughing, feverish, her cold hands reaching for the man who loves her, whispering his name with her final breath. And every night the audience weeps. They have been weeping for over 125 years. Mimì's death in La Bohème is the most famous tuberculosis death ever staged. More people have watched her die than have actually died of the disease in the modern era. Puccini's opera has been performed tens of thousands of times, on average, somewhere on Earth, almost every single day since its premiere in 1896. But Puccini did not invent her. He borrowed her from a real woman in a real garret in Paris, who really coughed blood into a handkerchief while the man who loved her watched helplessly. That man then wrote a novel about it, and then he died, himself, of the same disease, at 38 years old, in a charity hospital, penniless despite his literary fame. This is the opera that made tuberculosis immortal. The opera that turned disease into beauty, suffering into art, and a frozen garret in Paris into the most emotionally devastating stage setting in the history of music. Tonight, we ask why it still makes us cry. Welcome to the sanatorium. Tonight we explore La Bohème, Giacomo Puccini's masterpiece about love, art, poverty and death in the garrets of 19th century Paris. It is, by some measures, the most popular opera ever written. It is certainly among the most performed, the most recorded, the most likely to reduce an audience to tears. We will trace the opera back to its source, a novel written by a man who lived the Bohemian life himself, who knew the freezing rooms and the empty stomachs, who loved women who were dying of consumption, and who died, in the end, of the very same disease that kills his most famous character. We will witness the bitter rivalry between two composers racing to tell the same story, and see how one version became immortal while the other was forgotten. And we will follow the opera's descendants forward across a century as to Jonathan Larson's Rent and beyond, asking why we keep returning to stories of young artists dying beautifully. If you're new here, this channel explores how tuberculosis, the disease that killed 1 in 4 people in the 19th century, shaped everything from literature to music, from architecture to fashion, from the American West to the way we think about art itself. If that sounds like your kind of history, consider subscribing. Now settle in, find a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow. We have a long journey ahead, through freezing garrets and candlelit cafes, through opera houses and off-Broadway theatres, through stories of artists who died young and the art that keeps them alive. Let's begin. Paris. Christmas Eve, 1830-something. Imagine, if you will, a room at the top of a narrow building in the Latin Quarter. It is barely a room at all, more of an afterthought, a space carved from beneath the roofline where the ceiling slopes so sharply you cannot stand upright at the edges. The floorboards are warped, the walls are thin, the single window, small and high, is covered in frost, thick frost, the kind that grows when the temperature inside is barely warmer than the temperature outside. Through that frosted window, if you wiped a circle clean, you would see the rooftops of Paris stretching toward the Seine. Chimney pots, spires, the grey winter sky pressing down like a lid. 4 young men share this space. Rodolfo is a poet who has just burned the 3rd act of his play in the stove, watching the pages curl and blacken, giving up 3 months of work for 20 minutes of warmth. Marcello is a painter. His canvases lean against the walls, unsold and unsellable. Schaunard is a musician who has not had a paying engagement in weeks. Colline is a philosopher whose overcoat pockets bulge with books, the one possession he will not sell even when he is starving. They are artists. They are dreamers. They are at this moment slowly freezing to death. This is the world of La Bohème, the bohemian life of mid-19th century Paris, where young artists lived in beautiful squalor, creating masterpieces while dodging landlords and stretching every sou. It is a world of camaraderie and creativity, of grand ambitions and empty stomachs, of passionate arguments about poetry and painting conducted over tables where there was nothing to eat. And it is a world where tuberculosis waits in the shadows. In rooms like this, cold, damp, crowded, poorly ventilated, the bacillus thrived. It moved from lung to lung, invisible, patient, deadly. By the time someone began to cough, it was already too late. Into this garret comes a knock at the door. A young woman, a seamstress from down the hall, enters seeking a light for her candle. The draught on the stairs has blown it out. She's breathless from the climb. She coughs. She leans against the doorframe for support. She's pale and thin and, in the light of the single candle that remains lit, achingly beautiful. Her name is Mimì. She will be dead by the final curtain. In the next 2 hours, Rodolfo and Mimì will fall in love. They will quarrel. They will separate. They will reunite at the moment of her death, surrounded by the friends who have become family in this cramped and freezing room. The love story will be passionate and doomed. The death will be beautiful and terrible. It is one of the most performed operas in the world, produced somewhere on Earth, on average, almost every single day. More than 125 years after its premiere, audiences still weep at Mimi's death, still feel the chill of that garret, still believe utterly in the love story even though they know from the very first scene exactly how it will end. Tonight, we explore why. Why this story, with its consumptive heroine and its starving artist, has captured imaginations across 3 centuries, why tuberculosis became opera's favourite way to die, and why, even in an era of antibiotics and central heating, we keep returning to the cold garrets of Bohemian Paris. This is the story of La Bohème. Giacomo Antonio Domenico Michele Secondo Maria Puccini, mercifully known simply as Giacomo Puccini, was born on December 22, 1858, in Lucca, a small city in Tuscany. Lucca is one of those Italian cities that seems preserved in amber, ancient walls, narrow streets, medieval towers that have stood for centuries. It was a place where tradition mattered, where families carried their professions like inheritances. And the Puccinis were musicians. For 4 generations, stretching back to the early 18th century, the family had produced composers, organists and choir masters who served the Cathedral of Lucca. The position of director of music at the Cattedrale di San Martino had passed from father to son like a title of nobility. When Giacomo was born, it was simply assumed that he too would take his place in this tradition. He would learn organ. He would compose church music. He would serve God and Lucca as his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had done before him. But Giacomo had larger ambitions. He had heard something in music that the cathedral could not contain. At 15 years old, young Giacomo walked 18 miles to Pisa to see a performance of Verdi's Aida. 18 miles, because he could not afford the coach fare. He arrived exhausted, his feet blistered, and took his seat in the cheaper section of the theatre. What he saw and heard that night changed everything. I felt that a musical window had opened for me, he later wrote. The grandeur of the orchestration, the power of the voices, the spectacle of ancient Egypt recreated on stage. This was music that could shake the earth, that could make an audience forget to breathe, that could reduce a theatre full of sophisticated adults to tears. He knew, walking back to Lucca in the dark, that he would not be content as a provincial church musician. He would compose operas, the grandest form of musical drama, the art that combined orchestra and voice, and theatre and spectacle into a single, overwhelming experience. He studied at the Milan Conservatory, struggled through years of poverty that would later inform his portrayal of the Bohemians, and gradually made his name. His early operas, Le Villi and Edgar, showed promise but not mastery. Then came Manon Lescaut in 1893, a story of doomed love that established him as a major force in Italian opera, a worthy successor to the aging Verdi. For his next project, Puccini turned to a French novel about starving artists in Paris, artists very much like the young man he had once been. The novel was Scènes de la vie de Bohème, Scenes of Bohemian Life, written by Henri Murger and published in 1851. It was a collection of loosely connected stories, almost more like sketches, based on Murger's own experiences as a desperately poor writer in the Latin Quarter of Paris during the 1840s. We will explore Murger's life and death in detail later in our journey. His story is as tragic in its way as any opera. For now, what matters is that his book became the defining document of the Bohemian myth, the romanticised vision of the starving artist that would captivate imaginations for generations, that would shape how we think about creativity and poverty and the relationship between suffering and art. In Murger's stories, poverty was not merely endured, it was celebrated. It was a badge of honour, proof of artistic integrity. The Bohemians were poor because they refused to compromise their art. They lived in garrets because they chose freedom over security. They went hungry because they would rather starve than sell out. They were, in their own eyes, aristocrats of the spirit, superior to the bourgeois world that had money but no soul, comfort but no poetry. And woven through the comic adventures and philosophical arguments was a thread of tragedy. A young woman called Mimì, a seamstress and flower maker who loved the poet Rodolphe, and died, as so many young women died in 19th century Paris, of tuberculosis. Her death, in the original novel, is almost incidental. Mentioned in passing, one more casualty of the Bohemian life, but it haunted readers. It haunted Puccini. It was this story, this specific tragedy within the larger comedy, that Puccini seized upon for his opera. He would make Mimi's death the centre of everything. He would make an audience feel what Rodolphe had felt, watching the woman he loved grow pale and thin and finally still. La Bohème premiered on February 1st, 1896, at the Teatro Regio in Turin. The conductor was a 28-year-old named Arturo Toscanini, who would go on to become, by many accounts, the greatest conductor of the 20th century, a legend who led orchestras at La Scala, the Metropolitan Opera, and the New York Philharmonic. But that night in Turin, Toscanini was just a young man with a baton trying to bring a new opera to life. The premiere was not a triumph. The critics were mixed at best, hostile at worst. Carlo Berseccio, writing in the influential Turin newspaper La Stampa, delivered what became the most infamous bad review in operatic history. La Bohème, even as it leaves little impression on the minds of the audience, will leave no great trace upon the history of our lyric theatre. He could not have been more spectacularly wrong. The audience at that first performance knew something the critics did not. They had wept at Mimi's death. They had felt the chill of the garret, the warmth of the love, the terrible weight of loss. Whatever the critics said, they would return. They would bring their friends. Within 4 years, La Bohème was being performed in opera houses across Europe and America, in London and Vienna, in Buenos Aires and New York. Within a decade, it had joined the standard repertoire, one of those works that every opera company must perform, that every soprano must master. Today, it is one of the 3 or 4 most frequently performed operas in the world, beloved by audiences who may never have heard of Henri Murger, who may know nothing of the tuberculosis epidemic that gave the story its tragic weight, but who recognise in Mimi's story something universal and permanently true. They recognise love. They recognise loss. They recognise the terrible beauty of a death that comes too soon. To understand La Bohème, we must first understand the man who created its source material, and who lived and died the life he described. Henri Murger was born on March 27, 1822, in Paris. His father was a tailor and concierge. His mother helped manage the building where they lived. The family occupied a small apartment on the Rue Saint-Georges, not a slum exactly, but far from the prosperous quarters of the city. They were respectable poor, that most precarious of positions, always one misfortune away from destitution. Young Henri grew up knowing poverty intimately, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reality of cold rooms and carefully rationed meals, of clothes mended until they could be mended no more, of luxuries that existed only in the shop windows that he passed on his way to school. His father wanted him to learn a trade, to become a tailor like himself, or perhaps a clerk with steady employment and a pension to look forward to. But Henri had other ideas. He had discovered books, and through books he had discovered the world, of ideas, poetry, philosophy, the promise of a life beyond the narrow confines of his father's workshop. As a young man, barely into his 20s, he drifted toward the artistic circles of Paris. He tried poetry first, with limited success. His verses were competent but not brilliant. He contributed articles to small literary journals that paid little or nothing, sometimes only in copies of the magazine itself. He became part of a loose group of artists and writers who called themselves, with self-deprecating humour, les buveurs d'eau, the water drinkers. They were too poor to afford wine. The water drinkers lived the life that Murger would later romanticize in his fiction. They shared cramped rooms in the Latin Quarter. They pawned their belongings to pay rent. First the non-essentials, then the essentials, then everything they owned except the tools of their art. They went hungry for days at a time. They created poems and paintings and essays that almost no one wanted to buy. And they died. One by one, they died. Of tuberculosis, of starvation, of fevers brought on by cold and malnutrition, of the accumulated damage that poverty inflicts on young bodies not yet strong enough to resist it. The water drinkers left no monuments except in Murger's memory. The Latin Quarter takes its name from the language spoken there for centuries, Latin, the tongue of scholars and theologians who attended the Sorbonne, the ancient university that had stood at the heart of this neighbourhood since the 13th century. For hundreds of years, students had lived in these narrow streets, debating philosophy and law, medicine and theology in the language of the church and the academy. By the 1840s, Latin had faded, but the scholarly character of the neighbourhood remained. The area had become the heart of artistic and intellectual Paris, a place where ideas mattered more than money, where a clever argument could earn you a meal and a brilliant poem could earn you a reputation, even if it couldn't pay your rent. It was a neighbourhood of students and artists, of cheap cafes where debates raged late into the night, of bookshops where volumes were sold by weight when their owners could no longer afford to keep them. The most affordable rooms were the garrets, attic spaces at the top of narrow buildings, reached by climbing 4 or 5 or even 6 flights of rickety wooden stairs. These garret rooms were scarcely fit for human habitation. The ceilings sloped so sharply that you could stand upright only in the centre. The single window, small and draughty, let in a thin grey light and far too much cold air. There was no running water. You carried it up from the courtyard in buckets. There was no heat except what you could coax from a tiny stove fed by whatever scraps of fuel you could scrounge. In winter, ice formed on the inside of the windows. In summer, the roof baked in the sun, turning the garret into an oven. But these rooms were all that a struggling artist could afford. 3 or 4 francs a month, payable, theoretically. to a landlord who would bang on your door demanding rent at the most inconvenient moments. Murger and his friends inhabited this world completely. They spent their days in cafes, not drinking expensive coffee, which was beyond their means, but occupying tables for hours, nursing a single glass of water or perhaps a small beer, bought with coins scraped together from jacket pockets. They talked about art and philosophy and revolution. They argued about poetry and politics. They planned the masterpieces they would create when they had the time, the materials, the stability to create them. And then they climbed back to their freezing garrets and worked through the night by candlelight, writing poems that would never be published, painting canvases that would never be sold, composing symphonies that would never be performed. They lived for their art because there was nothing else to live for. The centre of their social world was the Café Momus, a modest establishment on the Rue des Prêtres Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois that features prominently in La Bohème. It was not elegant. The furniture was worn, the walls were stained with tobacco smoke, and the proprietor had long since given up hope of collecting what he was owed. But here the Bohemians gathered to share what little they had, to argue about ideas, and to forget for a few hours the poverty and cold that defined their existence. Between 1847 and 1849, Murger published a series of stories in a small literary magazine called Le Corsaire. It was not a prestigious publication, far from it. Le Corsaire was a satirical journal, irreverent and often in trouble with the censors, but it paid, however modestly, and it gave Murger a platform. The stories he wrote, loosely connected, episodic, semi-autobiographical, depicted the lives of 4 Bohemian friends and the women who loved them. They were comic mostly. The tone was light, ironic, self-deprecating. The characters schemed to avoid their landlord. They invented elaborate justifications for not paying their bills. They found ways to eat lavish meals and then slip away before the check came. But underneath the comedy was something darker. The characters were often cold. They were often hungry. They fell in love with women who were already dying. The reader laughed at their antics, but the laughter had an edge to it. The recognition that this precarious existence could collapse at any moment into tragedy. The characters were drawn from life, from the water drinkers Murger knew. Rodolphe, the poet, was Murger himself, his ambitions, his struggles, his romances thinly disguised. Marcel, the painter, was a composite of several artist friends. Chaunard, the musician, was based on Alexandre Chan, a real composer who had shared quarters with Murger. Colline, the philosopher, was drawn from a friend named Jean Wallon, whose overcoat pockets really did bulge with books. And the women, Mimì, Musette, and others, were composites of real women Murger had known in the Bohemian underworld. Grisettes they were called, working-class girls who sewed or made artificial flowers by day and drifted into the demi-monde by night. In 1849, Murger adapted his stories into a play, La Vie de Bohème, which was produced at the Théâtre des Variétés. It was a surprising success. Parisian audiences, many of them comfortable bourgeois, who had never set foot in a garret, found themselves enchanted by this vision of artistic life. They wept at the sad parts. They laughed at the comic parts. They came back the next night and brought their friends. What they saw was not poverty as it actually was, but poverty as they imagined it might be. Romantic, full of adventure and passion, redeemed by art and love. Murger had discovered something that audiences desperately wanted, a myth. In 1851, Murger gathered his stories together and published them as a novel, Scènes de la vie de Bohème. The book became a classic, reprinted in edition after edition, translated into languages that Murger would never learn to read. It defined for generations what it meant to be a Bohemian, and in doing so, it obscured the reality of what it had cost. Murger's genius was to transform the misery he knew into something audiences wanted to experience vicariously. In his stories, the Bohemians are not simply poor, they are nobly poor. Their poverty is a badge of artistic integrity, proof that they have not sold out. They could have comfortable bourgeois lives if they wanted them. Their education, their talents, their connections would have enabled them to find steady employment in some office or shop, but they have chosen differently. They have chosen to starve for their art. They are heroes of the spirit, too pure for commerce, too honest for compromise, too devoted to beauty to care about money. When they burn their manuscripts for heat, it is presented not as desperation but as a kind of joke, a commentary on the relative values of literature and warmth. When they dodge their landlord, it is a comic caper, not a shameful necessity. The reality, of course, was grimmer. Murger knew, because he had lived it, that Bohemian life was not a choice for most who lived it. They were poor because they had no money, not because they had rejected money on principle. They went hungry because they could not afford food, not because fasting was spiritually ennobling. They died young of tuberculosis, of typhus, of all the diseases that poverty breeds, not because early death was beautiful, but because poverty kills. The water drinkers did not toast their empty glasses with ironic cheer. They stared at them in despair, wondering when they would eat again. But Murger also knew, with the instinct of a born storyteller, that this reality would not sell books. No one wants to read about genuine misery. No comfortable Parisian wanted to feel guilty about the artists starving in the garrets above their heads. They wanted to admire those artists from a safe distance, to envy their freedom and their passion without having to share their cold and hunger. And so Murger created a myth, the myth of the beautiful doomed artist that would persist long after the actual water drinkers were dead and forgotten. The Bohemian became a figure of romance, an object of aspiration. The garret became a symbol of artistic authenticity, not what it actually was, a death trap of cold and disease and slow starvation. It was a beautiful lie, and like all beautiful lies, it had consequences. Among Murger's characters, Mimì stands out, and her story would become the emotional centre of La Bohème. In Murger's stories, Mimì is a grisette, a young working-class woman who supplements her meagre wages as a seamstress or flower maker by accepting gifts from male admirers. She's not a prostitute exactly, but she exists in the shadowy world between respectability and the demi-monde. She makes artificial flowers for a living, violets and roses crafted from silk and wire, sold to decorate the hats and dresses of wealthy women who would never acknowledge her existence. Her real name is Lucille, but everyone calls her Mimì. She is thin and pale, with hands roughened by needle pricks, and eyes that are alternately merry and melancholy. She coughs sometimes, a delicate cough that she hides behind her handkerchief. She falls in love with Rodolphe, the poet. Their relationship is passionate and stormy, the kind of love that burns too hot to be sustainable. They quarrel over small things, his jealousy, her flirtations with wealthy admirers, the impossibility of surviving on poetry alone. They separate, they reunite, they separate again. Throughout it all, Mimì grows increasingly ill, the familiar symptoms of tuberculosis emerging gradually, inexorably. The cough becomes more persistent. The pallor deepens, she grows thinner, weaker. There is blood on the handkerchief now. Everyone can see what is happening, but no one speaks of it directly. There is nothing to be done. In Murger's original stories, Mimi's death is not the dramatic climax. It happens almost casually, mentioned in passing. One more casualty of the Bohemian life. One more flower maker carried off by the consumption. The narrative moves on. The comedy continues, tinged now with grief. But when the stories were adapted for the stage and later for opera, Mimi's death became the emotional pinnacle of the work. Puccini understood what Murger had perhaps not fully grasped, that Mimi's death could carry the weight of everything the opera had to say about love and art and mortality. She dies surrounded by friends, in the arms of the man who loves her, in the same garret where she first appeared seeking a light for her candle. The love that began in that room ends in that room. The symmetry is perfect, the tragedy is complete. It is a death that audiences have been weeping over for more than 125 years. Here is the bitter irony at the heart of La Bohème. Henri Murger died the same way his characters died. After the success of his play and novel, Murger achieved a measure of fame and financial stability. He moved out of the garrets, he bought new clothes, he dined in restaurants where he actually paid the bill. Critics praised him as the chronicler of a vanishing world, the poet of Bohemian Paris. In 1859, he received the Légion d'honneur, the red ribbon that marked recognition from the French state of his literary contributions. He was 37 years old. He should have had decades of writing ahead of him. He should have been able to leave the garret life behind forever. But the damage was already done. Years of poverty, cold, and malnutrition had destroyed his health beyond repair. Tuberculosis, almost certainly contracted during his water drinker days, had taken hold in his lungs. The disease had been progressing slowly, invisibly, throughout the years of his success. Now, in the late 1850s, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The cough that had been merely annoying became constant, racking, bloody. He grew weak. He could not work. Whatever money he had earned from his books and plays slipped away, spent on doctors who could do nothing, on medicines that helped not at all. By January of 1861, Murger was nearly penniless again. The wheel had come full circle. The man who had made the garret romantic found himself once more without resources. He was admitted to a Paris hospital, the Maison du Bois, a charitable institution for the poor. He was too weak to care for himself. Napoleon III's minister, the Count Wałęski, heard of his condition and sent 500 francs to help with medical expenses. It was a generous gesture. It was also meaningless. No amount of money could cure tuberculosis in 1861. It was too late. Henri Murger died on January 28, 1861. He was 38 years old, the same age at which Chopin had died, the same age at which so many consumptives died, cut down in what should have been the prime of life. The man who had romanticized the Bohemian life, who had made poverty beautiful in his fiction, died in the same poverty that had killed his characters. The garret that he had transformed into a symbol of artistic freedom had, in reality, been a death sentence. The cold that he had turned into comedy had been tuberculosis, waiting patiently in his lungs. The myth he created outlived him, and continues to outlive him still, more than 160 years later. Bohemia, Murger wrote in the preface to his novel, is bordered on the north by cold, on the west by hunger, on the south by love, and on the east by hope. He had lived in all four quarters. He had died there. The influence of Murger's work extended far beyond La Bohème, far beyond the Paris that he had known. His vision of the starving artist became a template, one that would be repeated and elaborated throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The Bohemian ideal, once specific to a few blocks of the Latin Quarter, spread across the world. Wherever young artists gathered to pursue their dreams, they found themselves reenacting a story that Murger had written. By the end of the 19th century, the Latin Quarter had given way to Montmartre as the centre of Bohemian Paris. the artists of the Belle Époque, Toulouse-Lautrec painting dancers at the Moulin Rouge, Renoir capturing light on canvas, the young Picasso arriving from Spain with nothing but talent and ambition, inhabited a world that Murger would have recognised immediately. The garrets were a little warmer now, lit by gas lamps rather than candles. But the essential elements remained: poverty, creativity, community, and always the shadow of early death. In the 20th century, the Bohemian tradition migrated across the Atlantic. Greenwich Village in New York became the American Montmartre, home to writers and painters, radicals and dreamers. The cafes of the left bank, where Hemingway and Fitzgerald drank in the 1920s, were direct descendants of the Café Momus. The coffee houses of the Beat generation in the 1950s, the rock clubs of the 1960s and 1970s, each was a new iteration of the same myth. Each generation reinvented Bohemia according to its own needs. The artist changed, the art changed, the specific substances of addiction changed, but the fundamental elements remained constant: poverty accepted, even embraced for the sake of art, community among those who had rejected or been rejected by mainstream society, romantic tragedy lurking always behind the camaraderie and the laughter. And, always in some form, the shadow of early death. Murger had established the template, perhaps the most durable template in modern cultural history. The young artist dies young. In the 19th century, the disease was tuberculosis. In the 20th, it was heroin or suicide, or the accumulated damage of a life lived on the edge. In the 1980s and 1990s, it was AIDS. The specific disease changes. The underlying mythology remains. The garret is still there, waiting for the next generation of dreamers to discover it. When Giacomo Puccini decided to adapt Murger's novel into an opera, he did not know that another composer had the same idea. The story of what happened next has become one of the great rivalries in operatic history, though the truth of it remains murky, obscured by decades of accusation and counter-accusation. Ruggero Leoncavallo was a successful Italian composer, best known for his opera Pagliacci, a brutal one-act tragedy about jealousy and murder in a travelling theatre troupe. He was, by all accounts, an ambitious man, keenly aware of his place in the operatic world and protective of what he considered his territory. According to some accounts, primarily Leoncavallo's own, he had been working on a La Bohème opera for years. He had researched Murger's life. He had visited Paris to absorb the atmosphere. He had even, reportedly, offered Puccini a libretto for the project in 1892, which Puccini had declined, claiming he preferred to work with his own librettists. In March of 1893, the two composers ran into each other at a cafe in Milan. The Café Buffy, according to one account, or perhaps another establishment entirely. During their conversation, they realised with mutual horror that both were actively working on operas based on Murger's novel. The meeting did not go well. Leoncavallo was furious. He believed, or claimed to believe, that Puccini had rejected his libretto specifically in order to steal the idea and create his own version. Whether this was true, or whether both composers had simply arrived at the same source material independently, remains impossible to determine. But Leoncavallo was convinced of Puccini's treachery, and he was not the sort of man to suffer in silence. He launched a public campaign through the press, accusing Puccini of theft and betrayal. Letters flew back and forth in the newspapers. Each composer claimed priority. Each accused the other of bad faith. The musical world of Italy took sides. Puccini's response was characteristically blunt. What does it matter to Maestro Leoncavallo? Let him compose, I will compose, the audience will decide. And so both composers continued their work. The race was on. Puccini collaborated with two librettists, Luigi Illica, and Giuseppe Giacosa to transform Murger's sprawling episodic novel into a coherent operatic drama. It was a partnership that would produce three of the most beloved operas in the repertoire: La Bohème, Tosca, and Madama Butterfly. The collaboration was not easy. Illica was responsible for the dramatic structure, the plot, the stage directions. Giacosa handled the verse, the actual words that the characters would sing. The two men had different temperaments and different ideas about what the opera should be. Puccini, who knew exactly what he wanted, drove them both relentlessly, demanding revision after revision until the libretto met his exacting standards. The transformation of Murger's novel required significant condensation and restructuring. The original stories wandered. They were episodic, loosely connected, more interested in atmosphere than plot. An opera needed focus. It needed a clear dramatic arc. It needed, above all, an ending that would devastate the audience. The librettist chose to centre the work on two love stories: Rodolfo and Mimì, Marcello and Musetta. The other Bohemians, Shonald the musician, Colline the philosopher, became supporting characters. The various women in Murger's stories were consolidated. The comic episodes were selected for their theatrical potential. Everything else was simplified or eliminated. Most importantly, the libretto made Mimi's death the climax of the entire work. In Murger's original, Mimi's death is mentioned almost in passing. One tragic event among many in the chaotic Bohemian life. It happens, and then the story continues. In Puccini's opera, it becomes the moment toward which everything builds. The joys of Act 1, the comedy of Act 2, the heartbreak of Act 3, all of it leads inexorably to the final scene in Act 4, when Mimì returns to the garret to die. This structural choice transformed La Bohème from a series of charming scenes into a unified tragedy. It gave audiences something to feel at the end. Not just the pleasant melancholy of Bohemian nostalgia, but genuine, wrenching grief for a character they had come to love over the previous 2 hours. Puccini composed La Bohème between 1893 and 1895, completing the orchestration in late 1895. He worked at his villa at Torre del Lago, in the marshlands near the Tuscan coast, where he could compose undisturbed by the distractions of city life. The music is among his most accessible and immediately appealing, which is saying something for a composer whose melodies are universally admired. From the very first notes, the orchestra establishes a sense of bustling energy, of life being lived at full tilt despite the cold and the poverty. The love duets are soaring and romantic. The comic scenes sparkle with wit. The melodies are unforgettable. Rodolfo's aria about Mimi's cold little hand. Mimi's response, explaining who she is and what she dreams of. The glorious duet that ends Act 1 as they declare their love and walk out into the Parisian night. Musetta's flirtatious waltz in Act 2. Mimi's heartbreaking farewell in Act 3. Audiences leave the theatre humming these melodies. They have been humming them for over a century. But the sophistication of Puccini's score goes far beyond catchy tunes. He developed a system of musical themes, what musicologists call leitmotifs, borrowing the term from Wagner, that recur throughout the opera, transformed and developed as the drama unfolds. These themes are not just labels for characters, they carry emotional weight. They tell us what the characters are feeling even when the words cannot. The theme of Mimi's bonnet, first heard when she describes her simple life in Act 1, returns in Act V as she lies dying, but now it is coloured by loss, by the memory of what was and will never be again. The theme of the Bohemians' camaraderie, boisterous and playful in Act 1, becomes tender and mournful in Act 4, when the friends sacrifice their few possessions to help the dying girl. This technique creates a sense of memory within the music itself. As the characters remember earlier times, the orchestra remembers with them, bringing back fragments of themes that the audience has heard before, now coloured by everything that has happened since. The effect is cumulative. By the end of the opera, every musical phrase carries the weight of the entire story. The effect in Act 4 is devastating. As Mimì lies dying, as she and Rodolfo recall their first meeting, the orchestra plays music from Act 1, from the moment when they first declared their love, when everything was possible, when the future stretched ahead of them like an endless promise. What was joyful then becomes unbearably sad now. The melody is the same, the meaning is transformed. The music carries the weight of everything that has been lost. Let me walk through the opera's story. 4 acts that span roughly a year in the lives of our Bohemians, from one Christmas Eve to the following autumn. Act 1. Christmas Eve in the garret. The room is freezing. Rodolfo the poet and Marcello the painter are trying to work, but the cold makes concentration impossible. Marcello's painting, a depiction of the crossing of the Red Sea that he has been reworking for years, sits on its easel, abandoned. Rodolfo's latest poem lies unfinished on the table. To warm the room, Rodolfo makes a dramatic sacrifice. He burns the manuscript of his play, feeding it page by page into the stove. The fire blazes briefly, then dies. The warmth is fleeting. The art is gone. Their friends Colin the philosopher and Shaunod the musician arrive with an unexpected windfall. Food, wine, fuel and money, the product of a comic misadventure involving an eccentric English milord and a parrot. For once the Bohemians will eat well on Christmas Eve. But their celebration is interrupted by the arrival of Benoit, the landlord, demanding the rent that is months overdue, through a clever trick, getting Benoit drunk and then pretending moral outrage at his confessed infidelities. The Bohemians manage to throw him out without paying. It is a small victory, comic and slightly mean-spirited, but it is theirs. The friends prepare to leave for Christmas Eve celebrations at the Café Momus, but Rodolfo stays behind. He has an article to finish, he claims. The others depart. The garret falls silent. And then there is a knock at the door. Mimì enters, seeking a light for her candle. The draught on the stairs has blown it out. She is breathless from the climb. 5 flights of stairs are hard when your lungs are not strong. In the candlelight, Rodolfo sees that she is beautiful. Her pallor, her thinness, her evident fragility, all of it strikes him as lovely rather than alarming. Both candles go out. In the darkness, Mimì drops her key. They search for it together, hands reaching across the floor, their fingers touch. Rodolfo, moved beyond reason by this simple contact, takes her hand and tells her it is cold. "Che gelida manina," the aria begins. He tells her who he is, a poet, poor in worldly goods but rich in dreams. She tells him who she is. Lucia is her name, but everyone calls her Mimì. She makes flowers and embroidery. She lives alone. She waits for spring. They fall in love instantly, passionately, with the intensity that only the young and the doomed can muster. The act ends with them declaring their love and walking out into the Parisian night toward the cafe where their friends are waiting. Act 2. The Latin Quarter, outside the Café Momus. It is still Christmas Eve, and the streets are alive with vendors and revellers. Rodolfo buys Mimì a pink bonnet, a modest luxury, but one that fills her with joy. The Bohemians gather at the cafe, ordering more food than they can afford. Their meal is interrupted by the spectacular arrival of Musetta, Marcello's former lover, now on the arm of Alcindoro, a wealthy older man who is clearly besotted with her. Musetta is everything Mimì is not. Bold, flamboyant, calculating. She knows exactly what she wants, and what she wants right now is Marcello's attention. She sings her famous waltz, ostensibly describing how men stare at her when she walks through the streets, but really aimed directly at Marcello. It is a performance within a performance. Musetta using the cafe as her stage, the other diners as her audience, and the increasingly uncomfortable Alcindoro as her prop. Her strategy works. Marcello cannot resist her. Feigning a pinched foot, Musetta sends Alcindoro to buy her new shoes. The moment he leaves, she and Marcello reunite passionately. A military parade fills the streets. In the confusion, the Bohemians slip away, leaving poor Alcindoro to pay their bill as well as his own when he returns with the shoes. It is a comic ending, but with an edge. We have seen the Bohemians at their most charming and their most ruthless. We have seen love bloom, both the tender love of Rodolfo and Mimì, and the passionate, volatile love of Marcello and Musetta. And underneath it all, we have seen Mimì coughing delicately into her handkerchief. Act 3. A snowy February morning at a tavern near the Barrière d'Enfer, one of Paris's toll gates, where travellers entering the city must stop and pay their customs dues. It is dawn, snow is falling, workers are stamping their feet against the cold. Mimì appears, seeking Marcello. She has learned that he is living at the tavern with Musetta, who is entertaining the customers with her singing. She needs his advice. Her relationship with Rodolfo is falling apart. She tells Marcello what has happened. Rodolfo is jealous, possessive, impossible. They quarrel constantly. She doesn't know what to do. She loves him, but she cannot live this way. Rodolfo appears, also seeking Marcello's advice. Mimì hides behind a tree and overhears their conversation. At first, Rodolfo complains of Mimi's flirtatiousness. She smiles at other men. She accepts their compliments. She's not faithful to him. But Marcello presses him. That is not the real reason, and they both know it. Slowly, reluctantly, the truth emerges. Rodolfo's afraid. He knows Mimì is dying. He can see it in her pallor, hear it in her cough, feel it in the thinness of her body when he holds her, and he knows that his poverty cannot provide her with the care she needs. His garret is killing her. The cold, the damp, the lack of food and medicine, all of it is hastening her death. He believes that being with him is a death sentence. If she were with a wealthier man, in a warmer room with doctors and medicines and proper food, perhaps she might survive. Mimì, hearing all of this, cannot contain herself. Her coughing, that terrible racking cough, reveals her presence. Rodolfo rushes to her. The pretense of quarrelling falls away. They know now what they are facing. They decide to stay together through the winter. They cannot bear to part while the world is cold. But in the spring, when the roses bloom, they will separate. It is compromise born of desperation, and both of them know it will not hold. Meanwhile, Musetta and Marcello are having their own violent quarrel. Their love is a storm, always, and now the storm has turned destructive. The act ends with both couples, Rodolfo and Mimì tenderly reconciled, walking slowly away, Marcello and Musetta screaming insults at each other as the snow falls around them. Act 4. The garret again. Some months have passed. It is autumn now, and the trees that Mimì loved are bare. Rodolfo and Marcello are back in their old room, both pretending to work but actually pining for the women they have lost. Mimì and Rodolfo have separated. Marcello and Musetta have broken up again. The men try to comfort each other. They try to make light of their losses, but neither of them is fooling anyone. Schaunard and Colline arrive with a modest meal, bread, a herring, much less than they pretended to bring in Act 1, when the Bohemian life still seemed like an adventure. The four friends engage in mock combat, horse play. a burst of the old camaraderie. For a moment, the garret is full of laughter. And then Musetta arrives with devastating news. Mimì is outside, too weak to climb the stairs. She had been living with a wealthy viscount, the better life that Rodolfo had hoped for her, but she left him. She wanted to die in the garret. She wanted to die with Rodolfo. Rodolfo rushes down to help her. Mimì is brought in and placed on the bed. She's dying. Anyone can see it. Her face is grey. Her breathing is laboured. She cannot stop coughing. The friends spring into action. Musetta gives her earrings to Marcello to sell for medicine. Colline, in one of the opera's most touching moments, sacrifices his beloved overcoat, the one possession he treasures, the coat whose pockets have carried his books through all these years of poverty. He sings a farewell to it, Vecchia Zimara, Old Coat. It is a small aria, brief and quiet, but it carries enormous weight. In this world of poverty, a coat is not just a coat. It is warmth. It is identity. It is everything. The friends go out on their errands, leaving Mimì and Rodolfo alone. They talk. They remember. They recall their first meeting, the candle, the key, the cold hand. They recall the bonnet he bought her. They recall the love that seemed for a moment like it could conquer everything. Mimì falls asleep, or seems to. Rodolfo, trying to make her comfortable, goes to adjust the shade on the window. The light is hurting her eyes. The friends return. Schaunard notices that Mimì has stopped breathing. He whispers to Marcello. Marcello tries to tell Rodolfo without speaking the words, but Rodolfo sees their faces. He sees Musetta praying. He knows. He rushes to the bed. He takes Mimi's hand, the hand he took in the dark so many months ago. He calls her name. There is no answer. The opera ends with Rodolfo's anguished cry, "Mimì! Mimì!" and a devastating orchestral crash. The curtain falls. The audience weeps. Mimi's death in La Bohème is, medically speaking, remarkably accurate. A study published in The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, analysed her symptoms as depicted in the opera and concluded that Puccini's portrayal was consistent with advanced pulmonary tuberculosis, complicated by cor pulmonale. This is a condition in which the heart's right ventricle fails due to long-term damage from lung disease. The lungs, ravaged by tuberculosis, can no longer efficiently oxygenate the blood. The heart, struggling to pump blood through damaged lung tissue, eventually gives out. Mimi's cold hands, the gelida manina that Rodolfo sings about in his first aria, are not merely a romantic detail. They are a symptom of peripheral circulatory failure. Her breathlessness on the stairs is not a dramatic convenience. It reflects the progressive destruction of her lung capacity. Her weakness, her pallor, her gradual wasting, all of it is medically consistent with the disease as it actually progressed in the 19th century. By the time of her death, Mimi's body would have been in complete failure. Her oxygen-starved tissues would have been shutting down one by one. Her heart, weakened by months or years of struggling against damaged lungs, would have been unable to pump blood effectively to her extremities. The cold hands that Rodolfo takes in the dark of the garret would have been even colder at the end. Puccini got it right. Whether through research or intuition, whether guided by librettists who had witnessed such deaths firsthand or simply by the accumulated cultural knowledge of a society where tuberculosis was everywhere, he created a death that was both beautiful and true. But medical accuracy is not why tuberculosis became opera's favourite disease. The appeal was aesthetic, not scientific. Consumption was chosen not because it was common, though it certainly was, but because it was useful. It served the needs of the stage. Tuberculosis was the ideal operatic illness because it allowed singers to die beautifully. Consider the alternatives available to 19th century composers seeking a disease to kill their heroines. Cholera, epidemic in 19th century Europe, particularly in the great urban outbreaks of 1832 and 1854, kills through violent diarrhea and dehydration. The victim loses massive amounts of fluid, becoming gaunt and blue-skinned. Within hours, death can come in a single day. It is a terrible way to die, and absolutely unsuitable for the operatic stage. No audience wants to see that, and no singer wants to portray it. Typhus causes high fever, delirium, and a rash that covers the body. The victim becomes confused, unable to recognize loved ones, lost in hallucination. Again, dramatically unpromising. You cannot sing a touching final aria when you are delirious with fever. Smallpox leaves its victims scarred and disfigured. Bubonic plague kills with grotesque swelling of the lymph nodes. Dysentery, like cholera, involves symptoms that cannot be depicted on stage without embarrassment. Syphilis, though extremely common in 19th century Europe, carried a moral stigma that made it unsuitable for sympathetic characters. A woman who died of syphilis was presumed to have lived a life of sin. She was not a victim, but a transgressor. Audiences might pity her, but they would not weep for her the way they wept for Mimì. Tuberculosis, by contrast, seemed almost designed for operatic tragedy. The disease killed slowly over months or years, allowing for extended deathbed scenes. A composer could write a 4-act opera spanning an entire year, with the heroine growing progressively weaker, and the audience would understand and accept the timeline. They had seen it happen in their own families. Tuberculosis caused gradual wasting that could be portrayed as ethereal rather than gruesome. The consumptive grew thin, delicate, almost translucent, qualities that the 19th century associated with spiritual refinement rather than physical decay. The pallor and flushed cheeks, symptoms of anemia, and the hectic fever that came and went, could be interpreted as signs of delicate beauty. A consumptive heroine looked fragile, romantic, interesting. Most importantly, the consumptive remained conscious and articulate until very near the end. A woman dying of tuberculosis could speak, could sing, could express her deepest emotions with full awareness of what she was saying. She could say goodbye. She could forgive. She could declare her love one final time before the light faded from her eyes. A consumptive heroine could die beautifully, surrounded by loved ones, expressing her deepest emotions in song. The death could be tragic without being repulsive. Audiences could weep without looking away. And the soprano could bring down the house with her final aria, knowing that she was performing one of the great set pieces of the operatic tradition. Before La Bohème, there was La Traviata, Verdi's opera about a courtesan who dies of tuberculosis. If La Bohème is the most famous operatic death by consumption, La Traviata is a close second, and it came first. La Traviata premiered in Venice on March 6, 1853, 43 years before La Bohème would debut in Turin. The premiere was famously disastrous. The soprano was miscast, the audience laughed in the wrong places, and Verdi was so dejected that he nearly withdrew the work entirely. But within a year, La Traviata had been revised and restaged to acclaim. It would become one of the most beloved operas in their repertoire. The opera was based on La Dame aux Camélias, The Lady of the Camellias, a novel and play by Alexandre Dumas Fils. Dumas was the illegitimate son of the famous novelist Alexandre Dumas, author of The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. The younger Dumas would become a successful writer in his own right, but his fame would rest largely on this single story, a story based on his own life, on a love affair that ended in tragedy. Verdi saw Dumas' play in Paris in 1852 and immediately recognised its operatic potential. Here was everything he needed: a passionate love story, a strong-willed heroine, a tragic ending that would reduce audiences to tears, and at the centre of it all, tuberculosis, the disease that made the tragedy possible. In La Traviata, the consumptive heroine is Violetta Valery, a courtesan, the most famous and sought after in Paris. She lives extravagantly, surrounded by admirers, throwing parties that are the talk of the city. But she's ill. She coughs. She knows, though she tries not to think about it, that her time is short. She falls in love with Alfredo Germont, a young man from a respectable family, and for a time they are happy together, living quietly in the country, away from the glamour and corruption of her former life. But Alfredo's father arrives and demands that she give up his son. A courtesan cannot marry into a respectable family. She will ruin Alfredo's reputation, his sister's marriage prospects, his entire future. Violetta, in an act of extraordinary self-sacrifice, agrees. She pretends to have fallen out of love with Alfredo. She returns to Paris to her former protector. Alfredo, not knowing the truth, believes she has betrayed him. He publicly humiliates her. By the time Alfredo's father confesses what he did, by the time he gives Alfredo permission to be with Violetta, it is too late. She is dying. The consumption that has been advancing throughout the opera has finally won. The opera ends with one of the most famous death scenes in the repertoire. Violetta, briefly feeling better, that terrible rally that sometimes precedes the final decline, what doctors call the last improvement, rises from her bed, declares, "I feel life returning," and then collapses, dead. Alfredo screams her name, the orchestra crashes, the curtain falls. Scholar Arthur Gruss has noted that La Traviata may contain the first operatic death by tuberculosis. Whether or not this is precisely accurate, other scholars have identified earlier examples. It certainly established the template that La Bohème would later perfect: the beautiful young woman, the doomed love affair, the lingering death in the arms of the beloved. Behind Violetta Valery, behind all the operatic consumptives of the 19th century, stands a real woman. Marie Duplessis was born Rose Alphonsine Plessis on January 15, 1824, in a small village in rural Normandy. Her childhood was one of poverty and abuse. Her mother died when she was 8. Her father, an alcoholic peddler, actually sold her, to a man who used her as a child labourer and worse. By her mid-teens, she had escaped her family and made her way to Paris, where her extraordinary beauty caught the attention of wealthy men willing to pay for her company. She reinvented herself, changing her name from Alphonsine to Marie, adding the aristocratic du to her surname. She learned to dress, to speak, to move through high society as if she belonged there. She became one of the most famous courtesans of her era, a demi-mondaine, they called such women, inhabitants of the half-world that existed alongside but separate from respectable society. She was courted by aristocrats and artists, by dukes and diplomats. Franz Liszt himself was among her admirers. She owned a magnificent apartment, attended the opera in diamonds, drove through the Bois de Boulogne in her own carriage. She lived extravagantly, running up enormous debts, because she knew her career would be short. Beauty fades, youth fades, and she was already coughing. Alexandre Dumas Fils met her in 1844, when he was 20 years old and she was barely past 20. He was immediately infatuated. Their relationship was stormy and short-lived. He was jealous of her other admirers. She could not afford to give up their financial support, but it marked him for life. When Marie died of tuberculosis on February 3, 1847, at the age of 23, Dumas was devastated. He was in Marseille when he received the news. He could not even attend her funeral. By the time he returned to Paris, Her possessions had been auctioned off to pay her debts, and the apartment where they had been together had been stripped bare. Within months, Dumas had begun writing the novel that would immortalise her. In his hands, Marie Duplessis became Marguerite Gautier, the Lady of the Camellias, named for the flowers she always wore. The real Marie had favoured camellias too, perhaps because they have no scent and would not aggravate her cough. The novel cleaned up some of the more sordid details of her life, while preserving her fundamental tragedy. A woman of great beauty and sensitivity, trapped by circumstances into a life of moral compromise, redeemed by love but killed by disease. In Dumas's telling, Marguerite is not simply a prostitute, but a romantic heroine, a woman who sacrifices everything for love and is destroyed by a society that cannot accept her redemption. The novel became a play. The play became Verdi's opera, and Marie Duplessis, the poor Norman girl who was sold by her father and died alone in a rented apartment at 23, surrounded by doctors she could not pay, became an archetype, the fallen woman whose death purifies her, the consumptive beauty whose suffering ennobles. She would have been astonished, perhaps, to know that people would still be weeping for her over 175 years later. It is worth noting that in both La Traviata and La Bohème, the consumptive victim is female. This is not medically accurate. Tuberculosis killed men and women in roughly equal numbers throughout the 19th century, and in some periods and places it actually killed more men than women. Men worked in dusty factories and crowded workshops. Men lived in boarding houses and military barracks. Men, in many ways, were more exposed to the conditions that spread the disease. But operatic tuberculosis was overwhelmingly a women's disease. The dying consumptive on the 19th century stage was almost always female. The reasons were cultural, not medical. In 19th century opera, and in 19th century culture more broadly, the dying woman was a figure of intense emotional and aesthetic interest. Her death was beautiful in ways that a man's death could not be. Her suffering was redemptive in ways that a man's suffering was not. A dying man might be heroic, might be tragic, might be mourned, but he was not beautiful in the same way. His death did not carry the same emotional charge. The consumptive heroine embodied a constellation of Victorian ideals about femininity, passivity, fragility, submission, selflessness. She accepted her fate without complaint. She forgave those who had wronged her. She thought of others even as she lay dying, worrying about the grief she would cause them. In death, she became almost angelic, a model of the feminine virtue that the living were supposed to emulate. This mythology served patriarchal interests, whether or not the artists who created it were consciously aware of what they were doing. The dying woman was the ultimate object of male desire, beautiful, vulnerable, utterly dependent. She could not threaten the man who loved her. She could not challenge him, criticize him, leave him for someone else. She could only suffer beautifully and die, leaving him to mourn her and to remember her as perfect. Mimì and Violetta are both in their different ways products of this mythology. They are presented sympathetically, even heroically. Their deaths are meant to move us, not to teach us a lesson about morality or social reform. But they are also presented as victims of disease, of poverty, of the men who love them but cannot save them. Their agency is limited to the choice of how gracefully to accept their fate. Neither woman rages against her death. Neither demands better treatment, better housing, better medicine. Neither calls out the social system that has condemned her to freeze and starve. They accept, they forgive, they die. It is a troubling pattern, even as it is a beautiful one. The consumptive heroine did not die with the 19th century. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, artists have returned again and again to the template established by La Traviata and La Bohème. The specific disease may change. AIDS replaced tuberculosis as the era's emblematic plague, but the underlying structure remains. Young love cut short by fatal illness, the beautiful death that cannot be prevented, the grief of the survivors who must carry on. In 1996, exactly 100 years after La Bohème premiered in Turin, a new version of the story opened off-Broadway in New York. It was called Rent, and we will explore it in detail shortly. But first, let me mention some other descendants of the operatic consumptive. The 2001 film Moulin Rouge, directed by Baz Luhrmann, is explicitly modelled on La Bohème and La Traviata. Its heroine, Satine, a courtesan and star performer at the famous Parisian nightclub, dies of tuberculosis at the film's climax, in the arms of the young poet who loves her. The film quotes Puccini's music directly and unmistakably, using La Bohème itself as a plot element. Luhrmann was not subtle about his sources. He wanted audiences to recognise the tradition he was working in. The 1993 film Philadelphia tells the story of a lawyer dying of AIDS, a gay man whose illness makes him an outcast from the prestigious law firm he had dedicated his life to. The film follows a structure remarkably similar to La Traviata. A talented person, stigmatised and rejected because of their private life, fights for dignity while slowly dying. Tom Hanks won the Academy Award for his performance, and the film brought the AIDS epidemic to mainstream audiences in a way that few previous works had managed. Even films that do not explicitly reference opera often replicate its patterns: the beautiful death of the young, the love that cannot save, the art that memorialises. These themes recur across decades and genres, always with an emotional power that seems to draw from something deeper than any individual work, from the template itself. Why does this story keep being told? Perhaps because it addresses something fundamental about human experience: the fear of loss, the knowledge that love cannot protect us from death, the desperate hope that beauty and meaning can somehow transcend mortality. The consumptive heroine dies, but her story lives on. Mimì is dead by the final curtain, but Rodolfo will remember her, and we, the audience, will remember her with him. In this sense, art becomes a kind of immortality. The death that cannot be prevented can at least be transformed into something beautiful, something that endures beyond the individual life. There is, of course, something troubling about this. The real deaths from tuberculosis were not beautiful. They were messy, painful, prolonged. The real Marie Duplessis did not die in her lover's arms singing of redemption. She died alone, in debt, abandoned by the men who had used her and moved on. The real Bohemians of the Latin Quarter did not die poetically. They died in cold rooms, coughing blood, terrified. But opera is not documentary. It does not pretend to show us life as it is. It shows us life as we wish it could be, or as we fear it might be, transformed into music and spectacle. The consumptive heroine is a fantasy, yes, but she is a fantasy that speaks to real fears and real hopes. We keep returning to her because death is real, and love is real, and the gap between what we want and what we get is always there, yawning beneath our feet. La Bohème gives us a way to feel that gap, to mourn what is lost, to celebrate what remains, to experience the full weight of human transience in a safe, aesthetically controlled form. For 2 hours we weep for Mimì, and then the curtain falls and we return to our lives, which, unlike hers, continue. On the evening of January 25th, 1996, a 35-year-old composer named Jonathan Larson went to bed in his New York apartment. It was the eve of something he had been working toward for 7 years. Since before the fall of the Berlin Wall, since before the Gulf War, since before the internet became part of everyday life. The next morning, Rent, the musical he had poured his heart and soul into, would have its final preview performance at the New York Theatre Workshop, a small off-Broadway venue that had nurtured the project through its long gestation. Larson never woke up. He died in his sleep of an aortic dissection, a sudden tear in the main blood vessel leading from the heart. The condition, caused by a congenital defect that had never been diagnosed, killed him almost instantly. He was alone in his apartment. He was just hours away from seeing his life's work presented to an audience. The cast and crew learned of his death the next morning. They were devastated. Some wanted to cancel the performance, but they decided, after agonised discussion, to go on, not as a full performance but as a memorial, a way of honouring the man who had created the work they loved. They sat on stools on the stage, dressed simply, and sang through the score. There would be no blocking, no costumes, no elaborate production, just the music and the words. The audience, many of them in tears before the first song ended, understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a work of art born in tragedy, baptized in grief. Rent had become, in the most terrible way imaginable, a piece about itself, about young artists dying too soon, about communities formed in the face of loss, about the urgent question of how to measure a life when there may not be much time left. Rent went on to become one of the most successful musicals in Broadway history. Jonathan Larson had conceived of Rent in 1988, when he was 28 years old and still struggling to make his mark in the theatre. He had been inspired by a suggestion from the playwright Billy Aronson, who wanted to create a musical based on Puccini's La Bohème, in which the luscious splendour of Puccini's world would be replaced with the coarseness and noise of modern New York. Aronson knew Larson was a talented composer with rock sensibilities. He thought they might collaborate on bringing the Bohemians into the 20th century. Larson took the idea and ran with it, eventually running so far that Aronson gave up his creative stake and Larson continued alone. He moved the action from the Latin Quarter of 1830s Paris to the East Village of late 1980s New York, Alphabet City, the neighbourhood below 14th Street where struggling artists actually lived, where squatters occupied abandoned buildings, where drugs were sold on street corners, and the sound of sirens was constant. He replaced Murger's Bohemians with their contemporary equivalents, struggling rock musicians trying to write the one song that would matter, documentary filmmakers capturing life on the streets, performance artists pushing boundaries in small downtown venues. And he replaced tuberculosis with HIV/AIDS. The parallels to La Bohème are extensive and deliberate. Rodolfo the poet becomes Roger, a rock musician whose former girlfriend died of AIDS and who now struggles to write music that means something. Marcello the painter becomes Mark, a documentary filmmaker who observes and records the lives of his friends. Musetta the singer becomes Maureen, a performance artist with an ego as large as her talent. Colleen the philosopher becomes Tom Collins, a gay professor of computer philosophy. And Mimì, the seamstress, who coughs and shivers and dies of tuberculosis, becomes Mimì, an exotic dancer at the Cat Scratch Club, a drug user, HIV positive. In Rent, as in La Bohème, two love stories intertwine. Roger and Mimì fall in love despite, or because of, their shared mortality. Roger is also HIV positive. His former girlfriend April had slit her wrists when she learned her diagnosis, and he has been hiding in his apartment ever since. Mark, like Marcello, serves as the observer and narrator of the group, the one who survives to tell the story. The friends support each other through poverty and illness, through quarrels and reconciliations, through love affairs that bloom and wither and sometimes bloom again. To understand Rent, you must understand the world in which it was created, By the late 1980s, HIV/AIDS had devastated the artistic communities of New York. The disease, first identified in 1981, had spread with terrifying speed through gay and bisexual men, through intravenous drug users, through anyone whose blood came into contact with infected blood. The early years were marked by confusion and denial. What was this disease? Where had it come from? Why did it seem to target certain communities? And then, as understanding grew, by fear and stigma and abandonment. There was no effective treatment. AZT, the first drug approved to fight EUVUS, had severe side effects and limited effectiveness. Diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. Not immediate, not always quick, but inexorable. Young men in their 20s and 30s, artists and dancers and writers and musicians, developed the lesions of Kaposi's sarcoma, the wasting of AIDS-related illness, the pneumonia that would fill their lungs and drown them. The government's response was slow and inadequate. Criminally so, many believed. President Reagan did not mention AIDS publicly until 1985, 4 years after the epidemic had been identified, by which point thousands had already died. Funding for research was pathetic. Prevention efforts were hampered by moralism and fear of talking about sex. The East Village, where Rent is set, was the epicenter of a cultural movement that combined artistic experimentation with political activism. S It Up, the AIDS coalition to unleash power, staged protests and die-ins, demanding action from a government that seemed content to let gay men die. Grand Fury created posters and art that forced the epidemic into public consciousness. Artists created work that addressed AIDS directly, refusing the silence that mainstream society wanted to impose. Jonathan Larson was part of this world. He was not gay himself, but he had friends who were. He had friends who were HIV positive. He attended funerals, too many funerals, for people his own age who should have had decades of life ahead of them. He knew that the Bohemian ideal of artistic community now came with a terrible price. And he saw, in Puccini's century-old opera, a template for expressing this experience. The parallels were too strong to ignore. The genius of Rent lies in recognizing that tuberculosis and AIDS occupied remarkably similar cultural spaces, a century apart. Both diseases were associated with marginalized communities. Tuberculosis struck the urban poor, the immigrants, the artists who lived in cheap, crowded, poorly ventilated housing. AIDS struck gay men, drug users, sex workers, people already stigmatized by mainstream society, already pushed to the margins, already vulnerable. Both diseases inspired fear and discrimination. Tuberculosis patients were isolated in sanatoriums, shunned by neighbours who feared contagion, denied employment and housing. AIDS patients faced similar isolation, fired from jobs when their diagnosis became known, evicted from apartments, rejected by families who could not accept their illness or the behaviour that had led to it. Both diseases became linked, in the cultural imagination, with questions of morality. Were the victims somehow responsible for their illness? Had they brought it on themselves through their behaviour, their choices, their way of life? The consumptive was suspected of having burned too bright, having exhausted herself through passion and excess. The AIDS patient was blamed for sexual promiscuity, for drug use, for being gay in a society that insisted homosexuality was a sin. And both diseases tragically killed young people, people in the prime of creative life, people who should have had decades of work ahead of them. Keats died of tuberculosis at 25. Keith Haring died of AIDS at 31. The list of artists taken by these diseases is endless and heartbreaking. Larson understood these parallels intuitively. By framing his story of the AIDS epidemic through the lens of La Bohème, He gave audiences a way to connect present suffering with past suffering, to see themselves as part of a longer history of loss and resilience. The Bohemians of 1990s New York were descendants of the Bohemians of 1840s Paris. The community that formed around HIV was a descendant of the community that formed around tuberculosis. The disease changed. The human response to gather together, to support each other, to make art in the face of death, remained the same. Rent differs from La Bohème in one crucial respect. It is a musical, not an opera. This distinction matters more than you might think. Opera is sung throughout. Every word, every emotion is conveyed in song. Musicals alternate between spoken dialogue and musical numbers, allowing for a different kind of pacing and a different relationship between ordinary speech and heightened emotion. Opera tends toward grandeur, and formality toward orchestral richness and vocal technique. Musicals can be more casual, more contemporary in their sound and their style. Larson's score for Rent draws on rock, pop, gospel and Latin music, genres that would have been completely foreign to Puccini. The electric guitars, the drum machines, the funk bass lines, all of it places the work firmly in its moment in the sound of 1990s New York. When the characters sing, they sound like they belong to their era. The result is a work that speaks the musical language of its audience. The most famous number, the one that escaped the show and became a cultural phenomenon in its own right, opens the second act. It poses a simple question. How do you measure a year? In days? In hours? In cups of coffee? The answer, sung in soaring gospel harmony by the full cast, is love. Measure your life in love. It is a direct response to the epidemic. When time is short, when death is near, when you know that you may not have decades ahead of you, what matters is not achievement or acquisition. What matters is connection. Love becomes the only meaningful metric. Other songs address the themes of the work more directly. The duet Without You explores loss and dependence. The bitter confrontation, Goodbye Love, stages the kind of quarrel that we see in Act 3 of La Bohème, when lovers who cannot bear to be together cannot bear to be apart. What You Own questions the values of mainstream society. Materialism, career ambition, the pressure to sell out and abandon the bohemian life for something safer and more respectable. And early in the show, Roger sings his statement of desperate hope. He wants to write one song before he dies that will mean something, that will last. It is the Bohemian creed in its purest form, the belief that art outlasts the artist, that the work matters more than the life. Murger would have recognised that hope. Puccini would have recognised it. It is the same hope that has driven artists into garrets for 200 years. Rent opened on Broadway on April 29, 1926, just 3 months after Jonathan Larson's death. It was an immediate sensation. Critics praised its energy, its emotional honesty, its willingness to address subjects that mainstream theatre had largely ignored. The New York Times called it an exhilarating landmark rock opera. The Washington Post said it pulses with life and passion. Even critics who had reservations about the music or the book acknowledged that something important was happening, that Rent was speaking to its audience in a way that few musicals had done in years. The show won 4 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, beating out such competitors as Bring In Da Noise, Bring In Da Funk. More remarkably, it won the Pulitzer Prize for drama, an honour rarely given to musicals, and never before to a rock musical. The Pulitzer Committee recognised what audiences had already discovered, that Rent was not merely entertainment, but a significant work of American art. It ran on Broadway for 12 years, closing in September 2008 after more than 5,000 performances. It grossed over $280 million. It spawned national and international tours, a film adaptation in 2005, a live television broadcast, and countless amateur and professional productions around the world. More than any other work of its era, Rent brought the AIDS crisis into the cultural mainstream. It made audiences who might never have attended an ACT UP protest, who might never have known anyone living with HIV, weep for characters they came to love. It created empathy across barriers of sexuality and class. It humanized a disease that had too often been used to dehumanize its victims. And it did all this through the structure of an opera about tuberculosis, written 100 years earlier by an Italian composer who could never have imagined the world his creation would eventually speak to. Jonathan Larson never saw his triumph. He worked on Rent for 7 years, often living in poverty himself, struggling to convince producers and investors that the show was worth staging. He waited tables at the Moondance Diner to pay his rent. He lived the Bohemian life that his musical celebrated, not as a pose, but as a necessity. His death at 35 has an eerie resonance with the deaths in his musical, and in La Bohème before it. Like Mimì, like Roger, like Angel, he died young, leaving work that would outlive him. Like Murger, he lived the life he wrote about and paid a price for it, though his price was not tuberculosis, but a congenital heart defect that no one had ever diagnosed. He had complained of chest pains in the days before his death. Emergency room doctors at 2 different hospitals examined him and sent him home, attributing his symptoms to stress or food poisoning. They did not run the tests that might have revealed the truth. In the years after his death, his family successfully sued the hospital for malpractice. The settlement provided some financial security, but no amount of money could bring back the artist who had created Rent or give him the chance to see what his work would become. The musical stands as his monument. Every performance in theatres around the world keeps his vision alive. The story he told, of artists struggling against poverty and disease, of love surviving loss, of community persisting through tragedy, continues to resonate with audiences who were not yet born when Larson died. Larson understood, perhaps better than anyone since Murger, why the Bohemian myth endures. It is not a myth about poverty. It is not a myth about suffering. It is a myth about meaning, about finding purpose in creativity, about valuing human connection over material success, about measuring our lives not in wealth or fame, but in love. That message has outlived him. It will continue to outlive all of us. We have traced La Bohème from Murger's garret to Puccini's orchestra pit to Larson's off-Broadway theatre. We have followed a story across 150 years, through 3 continents, through revolutions in music and politics and medicine. Along the way, we have encountered tuberculosis and AIDS, real deaths and fictional ones, artists who lived the Bohemian life and artists who died too young. What binds these stories together? What makes them, in some essential way, the same story told again and again? At the most basic level, they are all love stories. Rodolfo loves Mimì. Roger loves Mimì. The poets love the seamstresses and the dancers, across a gap of century and disease. And in each version, love proves insufficient to save the beloved. The love is real. The love is powerful. The love is beautiful. And the love cannot stop death from coming. The dying die. The living are left to mourn. And the audience weeps because they recognize this pattern. They have seen it before, or they will see it, in their own lives. This is a universal experience, perhaps the universal experience. To love is to risk loss. To form attachments is to guarantee eventual grief. Everyone who loves will someday lose. The consumptive heroine, dying in her lover's arms while the orchestra swells around her. dramatises what everyone who has ever loved already knows, that this too will end, that everything ends, that the price of love is the certainty of eventual loss. We weep for Mimì because we are all in some way either Mimì or Rodolfo. We are either the one who will die too soon, or the one who will be left behind. There is no third option. But La Bohème and its descendants offer something beyond the mere acknowledgement of mortality. They offer community. Mimì does not die alone. She dies surrounded by friends, the Bohemian community that has sustained her and Rodolfo through poverty and illness, through quarrels and reconciliations, through all the ups and downs of their brief time together. Musetta is there, praying. Colleen is there, having sold his coat to buy medicine. Schaunard and Marcello are there, doing what they can, which is almost nothing, but which is everything. Rent's characters face their diagnoses together, supporting each other through treatment and loss, through the endless cycle of doctor's appointments and drug protocols, and the slow decline that AIDS brought in the years before. Effective treatment. Angel dies surrounded by friends. Mimì survives, at least for now, because her community refuses to give up on her. Even in death, the individual is held by the group. This is the Bohemian promise. The thing that makes the garret bearable, the thing that makes the poverty endurable, the thing that makes the whole desperate enterprise worthwhile. Artistic community can provide what family and society often fail to provide: unconditional acceptance, support without judgment, love that does not ask you to be anything other than what you are. The water drinkers may be poor, but they have each other. They share what little they have. The bread that Schaunard brings, the wine that appears from somewhere, the warmth of bodies pressed together against the cold. They celebrate together and grieve together. When one of them falls, the others catch them. When one of them dies, the others remember. It is an idealized vision, of course. Real artistic communities are full of jealousy, competition, and betrayal. The history of Bohemia is not all solidarity. It includes plenty of broken friendships and stolen ideas, plenty of lovers who became enemies, plenty of collaborators who ended up in court. Artists are people, and people are complicated. But the ideal matters. It offers a model of what human relationships could be: connection based on shared values rather than blood ties, support given freely rather than transactionally, love that exists because people choose it rather than because they are obligated by biology or law. The garret may be cold, but it is not lonely, and that, in the end, may be the most important thing. There is another theme woven through all these stories: the power of art to transcend mortality. Rodolfo is a poet, Roger is a songwriter, Murger was a writer, Larson was a composer. These are people who make things that can outlast them. In La Bohème, Rodolfo's manuscripts are a joke. He burns them for heat. But in the larger frame, art is no joke at all. Puccini's opera has outlived its creator by 100 years. Larson's musical continues to be performed decades after his death. The art survives. This is the deepest hope of the Bohemian myth, that creativity offers a kind of immortality. The artist dies, but the work remains. The consumptive heroine breathes her last, but the audience will remember her, will sing her arias, will tell her story, will keep her alive in the only way that matters. It is a hope, not a guarantee. Most art is forgotten. Most artists leave no lasting trace. The cemeteries are full of poets whose work has vanished, painters whose canvases have crumbled, musicians whose songs are silent. But some art does survive. Lear, Bohème has survived, Rent has survived, and each performance is a small act of resurrection, the dead brought back to life through the living bodies and voices of performers. When a soprano sings Mimi's final aria, she's not merely performing a role, she's keeping Mimì alive, She's refusing to let death have the last word. We have moved from tuberculosis to AIDS to what comes next. COVID-19 killed millions of people, including many artists. The lockdowns devastated the performing arts. Broadway went dark, opera houses closed. The very possibility of live performance was called into question. Will there be a COVID Bohème? A musical or opera that does for our era what Rent did for the AIDS years? Perhaps. The template is there, waiting to be filled. Young artists struggling to survive, a community bound together by shared vulnerability, a disease that kills indiscriminately, that strikes without regard to talent or ambition or love. But perhaps the specific disease matters less than the underlying experience. Murger wrote about tuberculosis because that was what killed young artists in his era. Larson wrote about AIDS because that was what killed young artists in his. The disease is the occasion, not the essence. What remains constant is the experience of mortality, the knowledge that we will die, that those we love will die, that all our achievements and relationships and hopes are temporary. This is the darkness against which the Bohemian light shines. Every generation rediscovers this truth. Every generation finds its own way to express it. And every generation apparently returns to the garret, to the template that Murger created and Puccini perfected and Larson updated, because that template captures something essential about the human condition. There is one more element to consider, the relationship between the garret and the world outside. The Bohemians of La Bohème are not political revolutionaries. They do not seek to change society. They seek only to live their lives, make their art, and love those who love them. The outside world, represented by the landlord, by the wealthy Alcindoro, is an annoyance to be evaded, not an enemy to be fought. Rent is more politically engaged. Its characters are explicitly living on the margins, queer, HIV positive, homeless, addicted. The musical includes a subplot about a community protest against a landlord who wants to evict squatters. The politics of gentrification, of AIDS activism, of LGBTQ+ rights are woven into the fabric of the work. This difference reflects the different eras in which the works were created. Murger's Bohemia was pre-political. The idea of artists as a class with collective interests had not yet developed. By the 1990s, the personal was understood to be political, and artistic communities were expected to engage with broader struggles. But in both works, the primary focus remains on the intimate sphere. The lovers, the friends, the small community. The garret is a refuge from the world, not a platform for transforming it. This is perhaps both the appeal and the limitation of the Bohemian myth. It offers warmth and meaning at the personal scale. It does not offer a vision of how society might be organized to prevent the suffering it depicts. Mimì dies, in part, because she is poor. She cannot afford warmth, cannot afford medical care, cannot afford the basic conditions of health. The opera mourns her death but does not ask why such deaths occur. Why, in a society of plenty, young women freeze and starve and die of treatable diseases. Rent is more aware of these structural questions. Its characters are poor and sick in a city of wealth and health. The contrast is visible, and the injustice is noted. But even Rent cannot quite escape the gravitational pull of the beautiful death. Mimì survives at the end of the musical, a choice that Larson made to differ from Puccini, but the spectre of AIDS hangs over her survival. The audience knows, even if the characters can hope, that the reprieve is likely temporary. The garret remains a place of beauty and tragedy, not a launching pad for revolution. And so we return to where we began. a garret in Paris, a knock at the door, a young woman, breathless and coughing, seeking a light for her candle. We know how the story ends. We have known since the first scene. Mimì will die, Rodolfo will mourn, the friends will gather, their laughter turned to tears, their camaraderie tested and proven by loss, and then the curtain will fall, and the audience will applaud through their tears, and the singers will bow, exhausted and exhilarated, and the whole beautiful tragedy will begin again tomorrow night. And the night after that, and the night after that. La Bohème has been running, in one form or another, for over 125 years. Thousands of sopranos have sung Mimi's death, each one bringing her own voice, her own understanding, her own life experience to the role. Thousands of tenors have cried Rodolfo's anguished final words, their voices breaking on that desperate repetition. Mimì! Mimì! Millions of audience members have wept in the darkness, mourning a character they never met, in a garret they never visited, in a Paris that no longer exists. Why? Why do we keep returning? Because the garret still exists, not the same garret. That building was probably torn down a century ago. But garrets, like it, all over the world. Young artists still live in cramped apartments, still struggle to pay rent, still choose creativity over security. The poverty still exists, even if it wears different clothes now. And the love still exists. The loss still exists. The terrible gap between what we hope for and what we get, that gap is always there, always has been, always will be. We are all always reaching for something just beyond our grasp. We may have antibiotics now. Tuberculosis may be curable, though it still kills over 1 million people every year, mostly in the parts of the world we prefer not to think about. But death is not curable. It will never be curable. And the story of young love cut short, of creative community threatened by forces beyond its control, of beauty and meaning snatched away by indifferent fate, that story will never grow old. Murger died of it. At 38, in a charity hospital, penniless despite his fame, Larson died of it. At 35, alone in his apartment hours before his triumph. In some sense, we are all dying of it, of the human condition, of the limitations of mortal life, of the eventual end that awaits even the most brilliant and beloved among us. But the music plays on, the stories are told. The garret in memory and imagination is still lit by candles, still warm with friendship, still alive with the voices of those who refuse to let cold and hunger and disease silence them. That is the Bohemian legacy, the true legacy, beneath all the romance and all the tragedy. Not the romantic poverty that killed so many, not the beautiful death that we weep over from our comfortable seats, but the insistence, stubborn, defiant, unshakable, that art and love and community matter, that they matter even in the face of everything that would destroy them, that they matter precisely because they are fragile, because they must be renewed in every generation, because nothing is permanent except the human need to create meaning in a universe that offers none. And so, as the night deepens and the final notes fade, we leave behind the garrets of Paris and the lofts of New York. We leave behind the opera houses of Turin and Milan, the off-Broadway theatres of the East Village, the stages large and small where this story has been told and retold. We leave behind the singers and the composers, the librettists and the playwrights, the audiences who have kept this story alive for more than a century and a quarter. Next time on The Sanatorium, we will explore another chapter in the history of tuberculosis. There are more stories to tell, more lives to remember, more connections to trace between disease and culture, but that journey is for another night. For now, rest well. Let the memory of Mimì carry you gently into sleep, and if you found some measure of beauty in tonight's journey through the garrets and the opera houses and the pages of old books, perhaps leave a like, or share it with someone who might need it. Mimì is dead. The candle is out. The garret is dark and cold. But the love remains.